The vast, arid deserts of Africa. A large inhospitable area where many animals struggle to survive. Meerkats, however, thrive in this environment, spending most of their time in large groups foraging for food. So how can this be recreated in a zoo? It all starts with the 5 freedoms. In 1965, Roger Brambell introduced the 85-page report that eventually became known simply as the Brambell Report. This report stated that animals should have the freedom to stand up, lie down, turn around, groom themselves and stretch their limbs. A few years later in 1979 this concept was extended to include both physical and mental needs of animals such as avoiding fear and distress and being able to express normal behaviors. This then became the 5 freedoms that we know today. These include freedom from hunger and thirst by providing fresh water and a diet to maintain full health. Freedom from discomfort by providing an appropriate environment with shelter and a comfortable resting area. Freedom from pain, injury or disease by prevention or rapid diagnosis and treatment. Freedom to express normal behavior by providing sufficient space, proper facilities and company of the animal's own kind. Freedom from fear and distress by ensuring conditions and treatment which avoid mental suffering. The Zoo Licensing Act of 1981, which requires the inspection and licensing of all zoos in Great Britain, states that any zoo that is open to the public for 7 or more days within a 12-month period must have a license from their local authority to operate. The BALI Directive sets conditions for the import and export of many species within the EU that are not covered by other legislation. Any ground wishing to either import or export an animal within the directive must be registered and meet the BALI requirements such as notifying the Animal Plant Health Agency of imports from the EU to Great Britain. BIAZA, the British and Irish Association of Zoos and Aquariums, represents the best zoos and aquariums in the UK and Ireland. By being part of this organization and displaying the logo within the zoo premises, visitors can see that the zoo has a high standard of welfare for all their animals. WAZA, the World Association of Zoo and Aquariums, promotes cooperation between leading zoos, aquariums, wildlife experts, academies and universities, allowing these institutions to work together toward conservation missions across the world. The European Association of Zoos and Aquariums is the membership organization that sets standards for zoos and aquariums within Europe and Western Asia, and helps them work towards goals of education, research, and conservation. The Association of Zoos and Aquariums is a non-profit organization dedicated to the advancement of zoos and aquariums in the areas of conservation, education, science, and recreation. AZA represents more than 235 facilities in the United States and overseas, which collectively draw more than 200 million visitors every year. In addition, they dedicate millions of dollars annually to support scientific research, conservation, and education programs. The main roles within zoos are education, conservation, recreation, and research. Keepers are responsible for keeping a high standard of welfare and safety for the animals. Keepers will need to provide nutritional meals that are as close to their wild diets as possible. It is important to make sure all animals are always as healthy as possible. This means keepers will need to observe the animals and be able to notice any behavior changes. Some animals may even need training to make health checks smoother. This can be simple things such as training the animals to step onto scales, open their mouths for dental checks, or even just move into separate pens. Visitors are also an extremely important part of all zoos. Keepers are also responsible for making sure visitors are being entertained while also learning about the animals within the zoo. This can be done in many ways, such as informational posters around the zoo, animal talks given by the keepers, or even shows with some animals. With so much always happening at zoos, there needs to be well laid out records kept about all the animals. The main software used by zoos and organizations such as BIAZA is the Zoological Information Management Software, also known as ZIMS. This can be used to record data such as age, diet, parents and breeding. This can then be shared with other professionals that may need it. This data can be broken down farther into individual sections. Breeding information is one of the most vital parts of this, as it is the main backbone of the species' survival. Within Europe, this information is kept in 2 main records, ESB, European Studbook, and EAP, European Endangered Species Program. ESBs log breeding records of species and every animal within that species to help decide which animals would be best for breeding and manage them as required, whereas EAPs look at the more endangered animals and issues zoos with mandatory breeding recommendations in order to keep genetic diversity as high as possible. Captive meerkats require an enclosure that is as close to their wild habitat as possible. This means that there are some items that are extremely important. Firstly, the substrate within the enclosure should be as close to their natural desert habitat as possible. This means it should be made up of mostly rocky areas and sand that is deep enough for the meerkats to dig in without easily hitting any concrete or mesh. A burrow or some type of indoor shelter should also be provided so the meerkats can feel safe and not worry about predators. Finally, a varied diet is important to simulate the range of food that would be found in the wild while foraging. Within the wild, meerkats will mostly eat insects, however they will also eat things such as small rodents, lizards, birds and fruit when given the chance. They will mostly forage during dawn and dusk when the temperature are at their lowest, spending up to 8 hours each day looking for food. Meerkats will search in groups and constantly communicate to warn others of any approaching dangers. The meerkats at Camperdown are fed a mixture of fruit, veg, insects and zoo diet biscuit. In the wild, meerkats must search for their food. To replicate this, the keepers use different food presentation strategies such as scattering mealworms to encourage foraging and placing different fruit and veg in the meerkats' indoor area for them to choose from, so they are not being forced to eat the same thing every day. Due to being fed multiple times throughout the day, it is less likely that the meerkats will expect food every time the keepers walk past. This is known as a stereotypical behavior that is unwanted as it is unnatural for the animal. Many wild carnivores such as bears, live in large territories where they can travel for miles and hunt other animals for food. Captive bears that are deprived of this important natural stimulus can begin to show various issues, with the most common being pacing. This is usually caused by a lack of space within the bear's habitat, meaning it can't roam as it would in the wild. Another common behavior in bears is overgrooming. This can be a sign of stress or even injury. The injury could be from something within the enclosure or even a self-injury from being too stressed. Herbivores can also show unwanted behaviors when they're not provided adequate enrichment. Giraffes have been observed showing oral stereotypies, specifically licking non-food objects. This is believed to be due to not receiving proper feeding enrichment. In the wild, giraffes use complex tongue movements to completely strip leaves from branches. When they aren't provided feeders that allow these natural behaviors, giraffes resort to trying to lick other objects that can be found within the habitat. This could then cause injuries to the mouth of the giraffe. Due to being omnivores, meerkats can show a mix of these behaviors. Overgrooming has been observed in meerkats suffering from injury or medical issues. They can also become aggressive when stressed, bored or scared. Hand rearing is often needed in zoos if an animal is injured or even rejected by its parents. This can be vital in the survival of the animal but can also cause many issues. Hand-reared animals won't learn species-specific behaviors that would normally be gained from watching their parents. This can prevent them from behaving naturally once placed into their proper environment. These animals can also imprint on keepers. This may prevent them from identifying with their own species, making it incredibly difficult to introduce them to others. This can also cause an issue for animals that are meant to be released back to the wild, as they won't be weary of humans and could result in them being hunted. Depending on dominance, hand-reared meerkats that are being kept with other meerkats may teach unwanted behaviors to the rest of the group. Along with this, if the keeper caring for the meerkat isn't educated enough, they may not be feeding the correct diet, resulting in health problems. Providing species-specific enrichment programs as well as appropriate habitats is a great way to prevent uncharacteristic behaviors. For example, the main behavior that was displayed at Camperdown was the meerkats becoming scared when buzzards or even planes would fly above the enclosure. When the meerkats spotted this, they would all run into the indoor area as a group and would only come back out once they had confirmed the threat was gone. Without this indoor area, the meerkats could become overstressed, resulting in aggression and self-harm. Here we can see an ethogram taken before the enrichment was placed into the enclosure. 12 behaviors were observed over a 35-minute time period using 5-minute sections. Out of 95 total occurrences, digging made up over half with 55 compared to the next highest, which was feeding with 10. Next we looked at the welfare of the meerkats at Camperdown. It is clear that a high standard of welfare is held at Camperdown. The meerkats are fed multiple types of food to prevent them becoming bored with the choices. Some of these include different fruits and veg, along with insects and meerkat pellets. These pellets are high in nutrition and catered towards meerkats specifically. The food is presented 3 times a day using 2 main methods: scatter feeding and buffet-style feeding. The habitat at Camperdown provides plenty of space for all 14 of the meerkats to run around freely, while still having hiding spaces in the form of logs and rocks. There is also an indoor and outdoor shelter that both have a heat lamp to keep the meerkats warm. These covered areas also provide a sense of safety for the meerkats. With the amount of room and sand within the enclosure, the meerkats have plenty of opportunities to display natural behaviors such as digging, foraging, basking and grooming. Finally, all the meerkats are provided regular health checks to ensure they are as healthy as possible. Currently, one of the meerkats is under observation and is being treated regularly for seizures. Thanks to this high level of health care, the medication being given to the meerkat has managed to control these seizures. When deciding on an enrichment item to place into the meerkat enclosure, we wanted to implement something that would encourage natural foraging. We also wanted to make it appealing for guests to watch. With this in mind, we decided to stick to an October theme and chose to carve some pumpkins that we could put insects into. The meerkats would then have to find their way into the pumpkins to reach the food inside. This should encourage natural foraging behaviors that the meerkats would display in the wild. When choosing the enrichment, I hypothesized that the pumpkin feeder enrichment would cause a rise in behaviors such as feeding, foraging, and alertness, along with a decrease in resting behaviors such as basking and grooming. Once the enrichment was placed into the enclosure, many behaviors changed as expected, with feeding rising from 0 to 22 and foraging rising from 10 up to 40. There was also a decrease in grooming by 2. However, there were also some unexpected results, as basking raised by 1 and digging lowered drastically from 55 to only 18. Overall, the enrichment went well. It provided plenty of stimulation for the meerkats and for the few guests that were there. If I were to recreate this enrichment again, less pumpkins would be used, and they would be spread farther apart to encourage the meerkats to forage more. The mealworms would also be placed in the pumpkins before being placed into the enclosure, as the meerkats were already curious and gathering around the pumpkins before the worms were added. It would also be good to use multiple food types to see what the meerkats would prefer.